January 897. Rome shivers under winter's grip. In the depths of St. Peter's Basilica, grave robbers work by torchlight. But these are no common thieves. They wear the sacred robes of the Church. They have come to steal a pope. 7 months earlier, Pope Formosus died peacefully in his bed. Today, his successor will drag his rotting corpse from its tomb and put it on trial for crimes against God and empire. Welcome to the Cadaver Synod. Welcome to the darkest hour in the history of the Catholic Church. The 9th century convulses with violence. The Carolingian Empire crumbles into fragments. Rome bleeds through endless civil wars. And at the center of this chaos stands the papacy, part spiritual beacon, part political weapon, wholly corrupted by absolute power. To understand how the Church descended into such madness, we must journey back 50 years. Back to when Rome was the prize fought over by emperors and kings. Back to when the papal throne became a commodity bought and sold by the highest bidder. The year is 844. Charlemagne's empire lies in ruins. His grandsons tear each other apart in fratricidal wars. The Muslims control Sicily and raid the Italian coast at will. Vikings plunder from the north. In this apocalyptic landscape, Rome stands exposed and vulnerable. The city that once commanded the world now begs for protection. Local nobles seize control of neighborhoods. Rival families battle in the streets. The Pope, once the spiritual father of Christendom, becomes a puppet dancing to the tune of whoever controls the most swords. This is the era historians call the pornocracy, the rule of the harlots. Not because of sexual impropriety, though there was plenty of that, but because the papacy becomes the whore of political ambition. Noble families buy papal elections like commodities at market. They install their sons, their bastards, even children as pope. In 858, Pope Nicholas I takes the throne. He dreams of restoring papal power. He declares himself supreme over all earthly rulers. He threatens kings with excommunication. He demands absolute obedience from every Christian soul. But Nicholas dies in 867, and his vision dies with him. The power vacuum splits Rome into warring factions. The Spoleto family controls the south. The Tuscans hold the north. In between, the Romans fight street by street, church by church, for control of the eternal city. Into this chaos walks Formosus. Born around 816 in the papal territory of Portus, Formosus rises through church ranks like a man possessed. His name means beautiful in Latin, and contemporary accounts describe him as charismatic, intelligent, ruthlessly ambitious. By 864, Pope Nicholas I makes him Bishop of Porto, one of the most powerful positions in the papal court. But Formosus wants more, much more. In 872, he travels as papal legate to Bulgaria, converting pagans and expanding church influence. He baptizes King Boris I himself, binding Bulgaria to Rome instead of Constantinople. The Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople howls in fury. The Bulgarians love their new Roman priest. Formosus tastes power, and it intoxicates him. He returns to Rome as a hero. But heroes make enemies. Other bishops whisper that Formosus seeks personal glory over church unity. They accuse him of illegal ordinations in Bulgaria. They claim he violated canon law by leaving his diocese without permission. Pope John VIII summons Formosus to trial in 876. The charges are serious: abandoning his episcopal see, unlawful ordinations, conspiracy against the Pope. Formosus flees Rome rather than face judgment. John VIII excommunicates him in absentia. For 5 years, the future pope lives as an outlaw of the church he once served. But power in medieval Rome shifts like sand in a windstorm. John VIII dies in 882, possibly poisoned. His successor, Pope Marinus I, restores Formosus to his episcopal dignity. the exile returns to Rome in triumph. He has learned the first rule of survival. In the eternal city, yesterday's heretic becomes tomorrow's saint with a single papal decree. For 9 years, Formosus rebuilds his influence. He cultivates allies among the Roman nobility. He forms alliances with foreign powers. He positions himself as the inevitable choice for the papal throne. When Pope Stephen V dies in 891, the path to ultimate power opens before him. The papal election of 891 unfolds like a carefully orchestrated drama. Formosus commands significant support among the clergy. His political connections run deep. His experience in dealing with foreign powers makes him attractive to a church besieged by enemies. On October 6, 891, the College of Cardinals elects him Pope Formosus I. He inherits a nightmare. Muslim raiders devastate southern Italy. The Magyars pour across the eastern frontiers. Local nobles carve up papal territories among themselves. The papal treasury stands empty. The church's spiritual authority crumbles under the weight of political corruption. But Formosus possesses a vision. He will restore the papacy to its former glory by allying with the most powerful force in Europe, the Holy Roman Empire. The current emperor, Guy of Spoleto, controls much of northern Italy. But Formosus looks beyond Guy to a more promising ally, Arnulf of Carinthia, the illegitimate son of Carloman and great-grandson of Charlemagne himself. This decision will doom him. Guy of Spoleto has spent years building his Italian kingdom. He controls the Lombard crown. He has forced previous popes to crown him emperor. He expects the same submission from Formosus. Instead, the new pope begins secret negotiations with his greatest enemy. In 893, Formosus sends envoys across the Alps to Arnulf's court. The message is simple but treasonous. Come to Rome, and I will crown you emperor. Together, we will drive out the Spoleto usurpers and restore righteous rule to Italy. Arnulf needs no second invitation. He has watched Guy of Spoleto consolidate power in Italy for years. The papal invitation gives him the perfect excuse for invasion. In 894, German armies cross the Alpine passes and march south toward Rome. Guy of Spoleto dies unexpectedly in December 894, possibly of poison. His son Lambert inherits the imperial crown, but he lacks his father's military genius and political cunning. The Spoleto dynasty totters under the German assault. Pope Formosus watches his enemies crumble with satisfaction. His calculated betrayal is succeeding beyond his wildest dreams. When Arnulf's armies reach Rome in 896, Formosus crowns him Holy Roman Emperor in St. Peter's Basilica. Together, they rule Italy as partners in power. But even in triumph, Formosus makes a fatal error. He allows Lambert of Spoleto to escape. The deposed emperor flees south to his family strongholds in Spoleto and Camerino. There, he gathers the remnants of his father's forces and plots revenge against the pope who betrayed him. The revenge comes swifter than anyone expects. In April 896, just months after crowning Arnulf emperor, Pope Formosus dies suddenly at age 80. The official cause is natural death, but whispers of poison circulate through Rome's shadowy corridors. The papal election that follows splits the city into armed camps. Formosus's supporters rally behind Boniface VI, who dies after only 15 days in office. The Spoleto faction seizes their chance and installs their candidate, Stephen VI, a man consumed by hatred for his predecessor. Stephen VI is everything Formosus was not. Where Formosus was charismatic, Stephen seethes with barely controlled rage. Where Formosus built alliances, Stephen destroys them. Where Formosus looked to the future, Stephen obsesses over the past. But Stephen possesses one quality that makes him dangerous beyond measure: absolute conviction in his own righteousness. He believes God has placed him on the papal throne to cleanse the church of Formosus's corruption. He will not rest until every trace of his predecessor's influence is obliterated from history. The new pope begins systematically undoing Formosus's work. He invalidates papal appointments. He reverses diplomatic agreements. He declares all of Formosus's ordinations null and void, leaving hundreds of priests in canonical limbo. But these measures fail to satisfy Stephen's burning need for revenge. In the winter of 896, he conceives the ultimate act of papal vindication. If Formosus committed crimes against the Church, then Formosus must stand trial. The fact that he lies rotting in his tomb presents no obstacle to medieval justice. The dead can be judged as harshly as the living. Stephen VI announces his intention to convene a papal synod to examine the legitimacy of his predecessor's papacy. The assembled clergy understand immediately what their new pope demands. They will try a corpse. They will judge a man who cannot speak in his own defense. They will participate in a spectacle that will haunt the Church for centuries. And so we return to that January morning in 897. The grave robbers have completed their grisly work. Pope Formosus, 7 months dead, emerges from his tomb to face the judgment of his enemies. The corpse they drag into the light bears little resemblance to the charismatic leader who once commanded the respect of kings and emperors. Death has claimed its due. The papal robes hang loose on a skeleton. The flesh has begun its inevitable decay. The eyes that once burned with ambition now stare blindly at nothing. But Stephen VI sees only a criminal who must answer for his crimes. He orders his servants to dress the corpse in full papal regalia. They struggle to force the rotting arms through golden sleeves. They place the sacred mitre on the skeletal skull. They position the body in a chair, facing the assembled synod, propping it upright with hidden supports. The scene that unfolds in the Lateran palace on that winter morning defies human comprehension. Cardinals and bishops pack the hall, their faces masks of horror and fascination. At the center sits the corpse of Pope Formosus, dressed for eternity in the robes of his earthly power. Stephen VI takes his place as chief prosecutor and judge. His voice echoes through the chamber as he reads the formal charges against his predecessor. The accusations span Formosus' entire career: illegal translation from the bishopric of Porto to the papal throne, violation of canon law regarding episcopal dignity, betrayal of the rightful emperor, the Emperor of Spoleto. But the most serious charge cuts to the heart of papal authority itself. Stephen VI accuses Formosus of obtaining the papacy through perjury and corruption. If proven, this charge would invalidate every act of Formosus's pontificate, creating chaos throughout the Christian world. The trial proceeds with all the formality of a living court. Stephen VI addresses questions to the silent corpse. When Formosus fails to respond, how could he? The Pope interprets the silence as guilt. A deacon stands beside the body, supposedly speaking for the deceased, but his words only confirm Stephen's accusations. Hour after hour, the macabre proceedings continue. Witnesses testify to Formosus's crimes. Documents are read into evidence. Legal precedents are cited and debated. The assembled clergy participates in the charade, some enthusiastically, others in stunned silence. At the trial's climax, Stephen VI delivers his verdict. Pope Formosus is guilty of all charges. His papacy is declared null and void. Every ordination he performed is invalidated. Every appointment he made is cancelled. His name will be struck from the official records of papal succession. But even this sweeping condemnation fails to satisfy Stephen's thirst for revenge. He orders Formosus's body stripped of its papal vestments. The sacred robes are torn from the rotting flesh. The papal ring is cut from the skeletal finger. The 3 fingers of the right hand, those used for papal benedictions, are hacked off with an axe. The mutilated corpse is dragged from the palace and hurled into a common grave. But Stephen VI's fury knows no bounds. That night, he orders the body exhumed again and thrown into the Tiber River, Let the waters carry away the last trace of the man who dared challenge Spoleto power. But the river has its own judgment to render. Within days, fishermen discover the corpse floating near the Castel Sant'Angelo. Rumors spread through Rome that the body works miracles. The faithful gather at the riverbank, claiming that Formosus' spirit speaks to them from beyond death. Stephen VI watches his triumph turn to disaster. The Roman people, initially cowed by the spectacle of the Cadaver Synod, begin to murmur against their pope. They see divine judgment in the river's rejection of Formosus' body. They whisper that Stephen has committed sacrilege against God's anointed. The whispers become shouts. The shouts become riots. In the summer of 897, barely 6 months after the Cadaver Synod, Roman mobs stormed the Lateran Palace. They seize Pope Stephen VI and drag him to the same prison where he once held political opponents. The man who judged a corpse now faces his own trial. The charges against Stephen mirror those he brought against Formosus: abuse of papal power, corruption of church law, blasphemy against the Holy Office. But Stephen's judges show him no mercy. In August 897, they strangle him in his cell. The wheel of vengeance completes its revolution. The pope who desecrated his predecessor's grave dies in chains, his body thrown into an unmarked pit. Power in Rome shifts once again, as inevitable as the changing seasons. Stephen's successor, Pope Romanus, rules for only 4 months before dying under mysterious circumstances. He is followed by Pope Theodore II, who immediately begins undoing the Cadaver Synod's work. Theodore orders Formosus' body retrieved from the Tiber and reburied in St. Peter's Basilica with full papal honors. But Theodore dies after only 20 days in office. His successor, Pope John IX, continues the rehabilitation of Formosus. In 898, John convenes his own synod to officially reverse Stephen VI's verdict. The assembled bishops declare the Cadaver Synod invalid and restore Formosus to the papal succession. Yet even this vindication cannot heal the wounds inflicted on the Church's authority. The image of a pope putting his predecessor's corpse on trial spreads throughout Christian Europe. Kings and emperors who once trembled before papal excommunication now laugh at Rome's pretensions to moral superiority. The Cadaver Synod becomes a symbol of everything wrong with the medieval church. Chronicles describe it as the nadir of papal corruption. Reformers invoke it as proof that the papacy needs fundamental change. Artists and writers immortalize it as the ultimate expression of unchecked power's madness. But the Synod's deeper significance extends beyond the immediate scandal. It represents the complete subordination of spiritual authority to political ambition. In putting Formosus on trial, Stephen VI revealed the papal throne as nothing more than a prize in Italy's endless power struggles. The trial's procedural absurdity masked a more serious constitutional crisis. By retroactively invalidating Formosus' papacy, Stephen threatened the entire concept of papal succession. If one pope could nullify his predecessor's acts at will, then no papal decision possessed permanent authority. This constitutional chaos had practical consequences throughout the Christian world. Hundreds of priests ordained by Formosus found their holy orders questioned. Bishops appointed by the dead pope faced removal from their sees. Churches consecrated during his reign required reconsecration. The Cadaver Synod also exposed the papacy's dependence on secular power. Stephen VI could only judge his predecessor because Lambert of Spoleto's supporters controlled Rome. When that political situation changed, Stephen himself faced judgment and death. This pattern of papal dependence on noble patrons would plague the Church for generations. The great reform movements of the 11th and 12th centuries, the Cluniac reforms, the investiture controversy, the Gregorian reform, all aimed to free the papacy from secular control and restore its spiritual independence. Yet the memory of the Cadaver Synod lingered in the collective consciousness of medieval Europe. It served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power unchecked by moral restraint. It reminded Christians that even God's representatives on earth remained fallible human beings capable of monstrous acts. The Synod's influence extended beyond the medieval period into the modern era. Protestant reformers cited it as evidence of papal corruption and the need for church reform. Enlightenment philosophers used it to critique religious authority in general. Historians employed it to illustrate the gap between Christian ideals and institutional reality. Even today, the Cadaver Synod resonates in contemporary debates about power and accountability. It asks uncomfortable questions about the nature of authority and its potential for abuse. Can any institution, no matter how sacred its mission, remain immune to corruption when invested with absolute power? The trial also illuminates the medieval mindset's attitude toward death and judgment. In an age when the line between life and death seemed permeable, putting a corpse on trial appeared less absurd than it does to modern sensibilities. Medieval Christians believed the dead could be held accountable for their earthly actions, even after physical death. This belief system helps explain how learned bishops and cardinals could participate in such a bizarre spectacle without apparent moral qualms. They saw themselves as instruments of divine justice, not participants in a grotesque charade. The corpse before them represented not a fellow human being, but a symbol of corruption that required cleansing. The Cadaver Synod's procedural details reveal the medieval church's legalistic approach to spiritual authority. Every aspect of the trial followed established canonical procedures, from the formal charges to the witness testimony to the final verdict. The horror lay not in abandoning legal process, but in applying it to circumstances that defied common sense. This legalistic mindset reflected the broader medieval synthesis of Roman law, Germanic custom, and Christian theology. Church lawyers could cite precedents for trying the dead, drawing on ancient Roman practices and Germanic folk traditions. The fusion of these traditions created a legal framework that permitted almost any action if properly justified. The Synod's aftermath demonstrates the instability of medieval political arrangements. Within a year, every major participant except the corpse had met violent death. Stephen VI died strangled in prison. Lambert of Spoleto died in a hunting accident. Arnulf of Carinthia suffered a stroke and withdrew from Italian politics. This rapid turnover of personnel highlights the precarious nature of medieval power structures. Alliances shifted overnight. Enemies became allies, and allies became enemies with bewildering speed. The only constant was change itself, driven by ambition, fear, and the ever-present threat of violent death. The Church's eventual condemnation of the Cadaver Synod reflected broader changes in papal administration and canon law. Later popes established procedures to prevent similar abuses, including formal rules for papal succession and limitations on posthumous trials. These reforms helped stabilize papal authority and reduce the most egregious forms of corruption. But the Synod's legacy persisted in popular culture and historical memory. Medieval chroniclers described it in lurid detail, emphasizing its shocking nature and moral implications. Renaissance artists depicted the trial in paintings and sculptures that emphasized its grotesque aspects. Modern historians continued to debate the Synod's significance and meaning. Some see it as an isolated episode of medieval barbarism with limited broader implications. Others view it as a crucial turning point that exposed fundamental weaknesses in papal government and prompted necessary reforms. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. The Cadaver Synod was simultaneously unique in its specific details and typical of its historical moment. It represented the logical extreme of tendencies already present in medieval church politics: the subordination of spiritual to temporal concerns, the use of religious authority for political ends, and the corruption of sacred institutions by human ambition. Perhaps the Synod's most enduring lesson concerns the relationship between power and moral restraint. Stephen VI possessed the legal authority to convene his trial and the political support to carry it out. What he lacked was the moral imagination to recognize that some actions, while technically permissible, violate fundamental human dignity. This failure of moral imagination was not unique to Stephen VI or to the medieval church. Throughout history, individuals and institutions invested with great power have committed acts that shock later generations. The specific forms change, but the underlying dynamic remains constant. Power without moral restraint leads to monstrous results. The Cadaver Synod stands as a permanent reminder of this truth. In the cold stone chambers of the Lateran Palace, medieval Christianity confronted its own capacity for evil. The trial of Pope Formosus revealed not just individual corruption, but systemic failure of the institutions meant to guide human behavior. Yet even in this darkness, light eventually emerged. The Church's ultimate repudiation of the Synod demonstrated its capacity for self-correction. The scandal prompted reforms that strengthened papal authority while establishing checks on its abuse. The institution that produced Stephen VI also produced the reformers who condemned his actions. This pattern of corruption followed by reform would repeat throughout church history. Each crisis prompted soul-searching and institutional change. Each scandal generated its own antibodies, creating resistance to similar future abuses. The Cadaver Synod thus became not just a low point, but a catalyst for improvement. The trial's contemporary relevance extends beyond religious institutions to all forms of organized power. Modern democracies, corporations, and international organizations face similar challenges in balancing authority with accountability. The medieval church, as struggles with corruption and reform, offer lessons for any institution seeking to maintain legitimacy while exercising power. The Synod also illuminates the role of public opinion in constraining authority. Stephen V's initial success in convening the trial reflected popular support or at least acquiescence. His eventual downfall resulted from shifting public sentiment that turned against his actions. Even in an age of limited democracy, popular opinion ultimately determined political outcomes. This dynamic suggests that moral authority ultimately rests on popular consent, not institutional decision. Stephen VI held the papal office with all its theoretical powers, but he lost moral credibility when his actions violated community standards. The corpse of Formosus, legally condemned and physically desecrated, retained popular sympathy and eventual vindication. The trial's documentation in contemporary sources provides insight into medieval attitudes toward authority, justice, and death. Chronicle accounts emphasize different aspects of the story, depending on their author's political allegiances and theological perspectives. These varying narratives reveal the contested nature of historical truth and the role of interpretation in shaping memory. Modern readers must approach these sources with critical awareness of their biases and limitations. Medieval chroniclers wrote for specific audiences with particular expectations and prejudices. Their accounts reflect not just historical facts, but contemporary concerns and anxieties. Despite these limitations, the sources provide sufficient detail to reconstruct the Cadaver Synod's basic narrative and significance. The trial's shocking nature ensured extensive documentation, even if the surviving accounts disagree on specific details and interpretations. The Synod's influence on later church law and practice demonstrates the medieval institution's capacity for learning from its mistakes. Canon lawyers developed elaborate procedures to prevent similar abuses, including formal requirements for posthumous trials and limitations on papal authority over deceased predecessors. These reforms reflected broader changes in medieval legal thinking that emphasized procedural regularity and substantive justice. The Cadaver Synod's arbitrary nature violated emerging standards of legal fairness that would eventually become fundamental principles of Western jurisprudence. The trial also contributed to the development of the doctrine of papal infallibility by highlighting the need for clear standards of papal authority. Later, theologians would argue that popes could not err in matters of faith and morals precisely to prevent the chaos that resulted from questioning papal legitimacy. This doctrinal development represented an attempt to balance papal authority with institutional stability. By establishing clear boundaries around papal power, the Church sought to prevent both abuse and uncertainty while maintaining effective governance. The Cadaver Synod has place in the broader narrative of medieval Church. History illustrates the complex relationship between spiritual ideals and institutional reality. The same Church that produced saints and scholars also generated corruption and violence. This tension between aspiration and achievement defined medieval Christianity and continues to shape religious institutions today. Understanding this complexity requires moving beyond simple narratives of progress or decline to appreciate the ambiguous nature of historical change. The medieval Church simultaneously advanced and retarded human flourishing, depending on specific circumstances and individual choices. The Synod's shock value should not obscure its historical context and significance. What seems bizarre or barbaric to modern observers made sense within the intellectual and cultural framework of medieval Europe. Judging historical actors by contemporary standards risks missing the logic that governed their actions. This contextual understanding does not excuse or justify the Cadaver Synod, but rather helps explain how rational people could participate in such an irrational spectacle. The trial represented the collision of competing value systems and political pressures that left participants with no clearly moral choices. The Synod's aftermath demonstrates the medieval concept of justice as restoration rather than mere punishment. The Church's eventual vindication of Formosus aimed not just to correct a legal error, but to heal the spiritual wounds inflicted by Stephen VI's actions. This restorative approach to justice reflected Christian theological principles that emphasized forgiveness and reconciliation over retribution. Even the ultimate condemnation of Stephen VI served primarily to restore church unity rather than to punish individual wrongdoing. The trial's documentation in art and literature reveals its impact on medieval cultural imagination. Artists depicted the Synod in manuscript illuminations, frescoes, and sculptural programs that emphasized its moral lessons and emotional impact. These artistic representations often took liberties with historical accuracy to emphasize theological or political messages. They transformed the Synod from a specific historical event into a universal symbol of power as corruption and divine justice as ultimate triumph. Literary treatments of the Synod appeared in chronicles, theological treatises, and popular tales that circulated throughout medieval Europe. Each retelling emphasized different aspects of the story, depending on the author's purposes and audience. The Synod's transformation from historical event to cultural symbol illustrates the medieval fusion of history and legend. Contemporary audiences often cared less about factual accuracy than about moral instruction and entertainment value. This cultural appropriation of the Cadaver Synod ensured its survival in European memory long after its immediate political significance faded. The trial became a touchstone for discussions of papal authority, church reform, and the relationship between spiritual and temporal power. The Synod's influence extended beyond Catholic Europe to shape Protestant critiques of papal authority. Reformers like Martin Luther cited the trial as evidence of fundamental corruption in the Roman Church that required radical reform or complete rejection. These Protestant appropriations of the Synod often exaggerated its significance and ignored the Church's eventual condemnation of Stephen VI's actions. They used the trial as a weapon in contemporary religious conflicts rather than as a subject of historical analysis. The Synod's modern historiographical treatment reflects changing approaches to medieval church history. Early modern Catholic historians minimized its significance or explained it as an aberration. Enlightenment critics emphasized its barbaric nature as evidence of religious irrationality. 19th century historians placed the Synod within broader, narratives of European development that emphasized either progress toward modern values or decline from medieval greatness. 20th century scholars adopted more nuanced approaches that stressed historical context and complexity. Contemporary historians continue to debate the synod's significance within medieval church history. Some emphasize its unique circumstances and limited impact. Others see it as revealing broader patterns of corruption and reform that shaped institutional development. These historiographical debates reflect not just scholarly disagreements, but different approaches to understanding historical causation and significance. The Cadaver Synod serves as a test case for broader questions about the relationship between individual actions and historical change. The trial's enduring fascination stems from its combination of the familiar and the bizarre. Modern readers recognize the political dynamics and human motivations that drove the participants while recoiling from the specific actions they took. This combination of recognition and revulsion makes the Synod particularly effective as a historical lens for examining universal themes of power, corruption, and justice. It provides a concrete example of abstract principles while maintaining emotional impact through its shocking details. The Synod's lessons for contemporary institutions remain relevant, despite changes in political structures and cultural values. The basic dynamics of power and accountability that it illustrates continue to operate in modern organizations and governments. Understanding these dynamics requires careful analysis of specific historical contexts while recognizing universal patterns of human behavior. The Cadaver Synod offers both a window into medieval culture and a mirror reflecting timeless aspects of human nature. As we conclude this examination of the Cadaver Synod, we return to that winter morning in 897 when Pope Stephen VI pronounced judgment on his predecessor as corpse. The trial ended with Formosus condemned and mutilated, his body cast into the Tiber like common refuse. But the river rejected what the Church had condemned. The corpse of Pope Formosus floated back to Rome's shore, where faithful Christians recognized it as a sign of divine vindication. Within months, Stephen VI lay dead in prison, strangled by the same forces he had tried to destroy. The wheel of justice had turned full circle. The judge became the judged. The accuser became the accused. The living pope who condemned a dead predecessor found himself facing the ultimate tribunal that judges all human actions. In the end, the Cadaver Synod revealed not the corruption of one man or the failure of one institution, but the eternal human struggle between power and righteousness. It stands as a permanent reminder that no authority, however sacred, remains immune to the temptations that destroy souls and corrupt institutions. The corpse that sat in judgment 8 centuries ago has long since returned to dust. The palace where the trial unfolded has crumbled into ruins. The political arrangements that made the synod possible have vanished into history's mists. But the questions it raised remain as urgent today as they were in medieval Rome. How do we balance authority with accountability? How do we prevent power from corrupting those who wield it? How do we distinguish justice from vengeance, law from tyranny, righteousness from self-interest? These questions have no easy answers. They require constant vigilance, moral courage, and the wisdom to recognize that every generation faces the same fundamental choices between good and evil, justice and oppression, service and self-aggrandizement. The Cadaver Synod reminds us that these choices matter not just for individuals, but for entire civilizations. The decisions made in that Roman winter of 897 shaped the development of European Christianity for centuries. They contributed to reforms that strengthened church governance while exposing weaknesses that would eventually prompt the Protestant Reformation. History offers no guarantees against repeating past mistakes. Each generation must learn anew the lessons that previous generations thought they had mastered. The Cadaver Synod's dark legacy serves as both warning and inspiration, warning against power's corrupting influence and inspiration to build institutions worthy of human dignity and divine purpose. In the cold stones of the Lateran Palace, medieval Christianity confronted its capacity for both good and evil. The same institution that preserved classical learning and built Gothic cathedrals also produced the spectacle of a pope judging his predecessor's rotting corpse. This contradiction does not diminish Christianity's achievements or excuse its failures. Instead, it reminds us that human institutions, however noble their purposes, remain vulnerable to human weaknesses. The eternal vigilance required to preserve justice and prevent corruption represents not a burden but an opportunity, the chance to build something better than what we inherited. The Cadaver Synod's ultimate lesson may be that no institution, no matter how powerful or sacred, can survive without the moral commitment of the individuals who serve it. Stephen VI possessed all the external trappings of papal authority, but he lacked the internal compass that distinguishes legitimate power from mere force. That compass must be cultivated in each generation through education, example, and the hard-won wisdom that comes from studying history's triumphs and failures. The medieval church that produced the Cadaver Synod also produced the reforms that prevented its repetition. The same human nature that enables corruption also enables redemption. As we close this examination of one of history's darkest hours, we are reminded that darkness ultimately serves to highlight the light. The Cadaver Synod's horror makes us appreciate justice. Its corruption makes us value integrity. Its abuse of power makes us cherish accountability. The corpse of Pope Formosus no longer sits in judgment, but the questions raised by his trial echo through the centuries. How we answer them will determine whether future generations remember us as wise ancestors who learned from the past or as tragic figures who repeated its mistakes. The choice, as always, is ours.